If you remember the previous conversation regarding this political and also this economic relationship between the country of New Zealand and the US. Now, recently, the two countries' higher officials met up again, but for this time, it's not just about political and social engagement, but also the two countries seem to work on some major significant project, and that's right, the space sector. Now, at this moment, you're asking why the US is willing to cooperate with the New Zealand or simply sending the invitation to the country of New Zealand regarding the space project. And how about the national security? And also, how about the joint effort regarding the cybersecurity at this moment? And how concerning is China to both countries? So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our good old friend, Mr. Jeffrey Miller. And Mr. Miller is an international analyst with the Democracy Project. Mr. Miller, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for the welcome, Will. It's good to be with you again.
Absolutely, sir. It's always a thorough enjoyment to have the conversation with you. Now, let's get to the question. As we mentioned before, recently you wrote another amazing piece regarding this relationship between US and New Zealand, and the article's entitled, AUKUS Door Held Ajar for New Zealand. Now, as we mentioned before, the higher officials recently between the US and New Zealand met up regarding another significant project which is related to space sector. And this is something that you wrote, and I want to quote, "A tangible outcome of Sherman's trip was a sign of a new framework agreement to underpin cooperation between New Zealand and the United States in the space sector." Can you help us to understand what is the significance between this framework agreement in the space sector, and what kind of message did US send to New Zealand regarding this project?
Yes, Wendy Sherman, the US Deputy Secretary of State, was in New Zealand recently, and she's another in a series of quite high-level visitors to New Zealand from the United States, both political visitors and military visitors. We've had high-profile figures from both visiting New Zealand in recent months since New Zealand opened its borders and became accessible to foreign travellers again. And Wendy Sherman came and signed this agreement. It's more significant than it might appear. You might think, well, what does New Zealand have to do with the space industry? New Zealand is not about to send astronauts on to the moon or anything, and it's very true. New Zealand's not a traditional space power, and by any sense, given its size and its wealth, but it is playing a growing role through a private company called Rocket Lab, which was started by a New Zealander called Peter Beck, but it's got a lot of US investment behind. I think it's actually headquartered now in the US, but they have a launch site in New Zealand in the east coast of the North Island, and they launch a lot of satellites into space and other missions. They work with NASA, for example. They worked on a mission to launch a moon mission recently. They launched a capstone satellite that will help NASA with their preparations to go back to the moon. And Rocket Lab talks a lot about this kind of stuff, the science-based missions. But what they also do and what they talk less about are the military missions that they're doing. So they're also launching military satellites for the US government. And there's one estimate that I found that says about 30% of Rocket Lab's business is for the US military, the US military agencies. So this is where New Zealand becomes increasingly significant. So the US is very keen to have New Zealand support there. It's very useful to have New Zealand's involvement there in launching the military satellites, given that the space is becoming a even more contested area when it comes to the geopolitical contest. As great power rivalry heats up, China is becoming more interested in space. The US itself, countries like Russia, are becoming more interested. So, if we are heading into this sort of new Cold War period, and that's often what it feels like, you would expect the space race to be heating up as well. And I think New Zealand is playing a role in that, and this is partly explains why the US Deputy Secretary of State, why Wendy Sherman came to New Zealand. It's not the full story. New Zealand is really important right here on planet Earth as well, given everything that's been going on in the Pacific and the competition, geostrategic competition with China there. But yeah, New Zealand's getting a lot of attention at the moment from the United States, from China, from lots of countries actually.
Mr. Miller, again, I want to bring the country of China into the conversation, as you mentioned during the previous answer. And of course, on one hand, we understand the relationship between US and China, not only from this space competition, but also in this political and also this economic aspect. The two countries are deadlocked today. But meanwhile, based on our previous conversation, the relationship between China and New Zealand, it's also at stake at this moment. And given the fact that, again, the reality is New Zealand seems, I guess I want to be careful, has always been a good partner, at least on this economic side, with China. But meanwhile, that in reality, any country that partner up with the US to be what I called fight against China, or to be very cautious about the Chinese government, has not been proven to be very effective. So my next question to you is, how concerning is China today under this new cooperation between US and New Zealand? And why do you think that US is so desperate or is so eager to watch how China progresses in this space project?
Well, I think New Zealand's relations with China come largely back to economics. China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner by far. 33% of New Zealand's exports go to China every year. So, in terms of what New Zealand produces, primary products, meat, butter, milk, all of these products, China is a big buyer of all of these, and particularly milk powder. And the United States is not. The New Zealand tried to get a free trade agreement with the US through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the US was actually going to sign up to that, but Donald Trump at the last minute pulled the US out of that. So New Zealand actually exports relatively little to the United States by comparison with China, largely because of that. So New Zealand is just very keen to keep on good terms with China overall. And despite, we talked, I think, earlier in the year, I think we talked somewhere around the end of May, if I recall, start of June. I don't recall exactly, but at that point, New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern had just gone to Washington for a meeting at the White House with Joe Biden, and they put out a very hawkish joint statement together, the New Zealand and the United States. And China was very angry about all of that. And New Zealand really drifted quite far to the west, I thought, in the first half of the year by New Zealand standards. New Zealand adopted quite a pro-Western foreign policy. And a lot of that was triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then it continued throughout those months of March, April, May in particular, when China was also making a play for greater cooperation with Pacific countries. New Zealand sort of stood firm with Australia, with the US on all of this. Since then, I think you've seen some recalibration, and Jacinda Ardern gave quite a generous speech towards China last month, or in fact at the start of this month, on the 1st of August. And she also gave a couple of speeches while she was on a foreign trip in Sydney and in London, where she recalibrated and brought New Zealand back to a more sort of middle ground, if you like. where she said, look, China's really important to us, and she said that she wants to head to China when COVID allows, and she made a lot of soothing noises towards China. And the Chinese ambassador yesterday gave an interview to New Zealand television where he said much the same kind of things. He was also quite generous and, wanted to invite, Jacinda Ardern to visit China, hopefully by the end of the year is what he said. So, there are, I think we've seen a slight recalibration. But I think New Zealand still, ends up, where we stand, in mid-August or close to the end of August. I think New Zealand is still a bit more pro-Western than it was at the start of the year. And I think that's the big takeaway this year. New Zealand has shifted its foreign policy a bit more to the West. And that's really the big trend that I've seen this year.
Mr. Miller, I want to go back to the article, and again, I want to read something that you wrote, and I think, and I believe it's rather significant. And let's talk about that with your article actually included the new organization is called AUKUS. Now, this is what you wrote. It said, when asked at the time whether New Zealand has been asked to join, now the leader reinstated that New Zealand's new nuclear-free policy and said, we weren't approached and nor would I expect us to be. So help us to understand that what is the message behind this answer. So in other words, that New Zealand was not approached in terms of to be part of the AUKUS or in terms of understanding New Zealand's nuclear-free policy. And also it says, and nor would I expect us to be. How should we interpret such answer? So in other words, does New Zealand want to always be an outsider as for Quad and also for AUKUS, or is there anything that the leader today is hinting that to say, hey, listen, since Australia is actively participating in some of them, or US is inviting us or possibly could invite us to be part of them, and so we may be considering, or it's better for us to be a bench player on the side, not to destroy or not to ruin this relationship between New Zealand and China. What is your take on?
Yes, New Zealand's positioning with AUKUS is quite ambiguous. So AUKUS was unveiled almost a year ago in mid-September 2021. And it's an agreement between, as the name suggests, between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom. And the launch project for AUKUS was providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. And for New Zealand, that's really kind of, it's number one, the idea of New Zealand having submarines is fanciful, really. And the idea of New Zealand having any involvement with nuclear-powered submarines is fanciful as well, because New Zealand has had a nuclear-free policy for almost 40 years. So the idea of New Zealand, being involved in an alliance that's about nuclear-powered submarines just doesn't seem credible. And that's why Jacinda Ardern said, we weren't approached, nor would we expect to be. So New Zealand was not informed about this or involved in the discussions. I think she got a phone call the night before just to say it would be being announced. But New Zealand was kept out of that. But what has been interesting since AUKUS was launched is that it seems to have been developed into something a bit more than just nuclear submarines. And the key phrase that seems to be used now is technology sharing. And it's being seen as a framework to work on, various new technologies, hypersonic missiles, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and this kind of thing. It's all a bit vague, and of course, these things usually are vague somewhat by design. But New Zealand has expressed a willingness, or at least figures from New Zealand have expressed some willingness to be involved in the non-nuclear components of AUKUS. So the cybersecurity side of things, the New Zealand High Commissioner to Australia, Annette King, and she signalled this towards the end of last year. So did the Defence Minister in New Zealand, Penny Henare. And I think this is, it's not by accident. And I think New Zealand is considering this. And perhaps not immediately. I don't think you're going to see New Zealand probably joining AUKUS, this year. But I think clearly that this seems to be the game plan from the US side, is to try and get New Zealand involved in some form, and to say, look, you're not involved in the nuclear side. We understand you've got the nuclear-free policy, but we want you to be involved in, let's call it AUKUS Plus, where it's the cybersecurity, the technology side of things. And the question really about all of this is whether that is in New Zealand's interest, because New Zealand does talk about having an independent foreign policy, and that's something that's been talked about a lot in the last few months. China keeps reminding New Zealand of its independent foreign policy, and Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand, has also talked a lot about independent foreign policy in the last few months. So independent foreign policy, effectively, it's a key phrase in New Zealand politics that goes back to the 1980s when this nuclear-free policy was developed. And essentially, I think nuclear-free policy just suggests that New Zealand makes its own way in the world and doesn't get aligned with the great powers. So effectively, New Zealand wants to be a friend with everybody and just sell lots of milk powder and keep it at that, really, and not get involved in military alliances and groupings. So that's why New Zealand's not part of AUKUS or the Quad or any of these groupings. New Zealand was part of ANZUS, but the United States suspended its obligations to New Zealand back in 1986 over the nuclear-free policy. So it would be a big shift for New Zealand to join AUKUS, but that said, we're seeing a lot of big shifts at the moment. New Zealand's increasing its military spending at the moment, and this is a big shift for New Zealand after, for decades that spending had been trending downwards, went down to as low as about 1.1%. We're now up to 1.5%. So I wouldn't rule anything out. And certainly the way I see things is that the door is being held ajar. I think that was the title I used for the article. And Wendy Sherman, the US Deputy Secretary of State, that really seems to be seeing things in those terms as well, that New Zealand could join for non-nuclear purposes. So it's an interesting strategy by the US. They're not trying to change New Zealand's nuclear-free policy, which is actually what they were trying to do if you go back sort of 15 years ago. The US focus was much more on, you should change your nuclear-free policy. That's an old 1980s idea. You should give up on that because, it's a bit outdated. But they're not trying that now. They fully accept the nuclear-free policy as a cornerstone of New Zealand's politics and is not going to change. And instead, they're trying to, I think, get New Zealand in through the back door to focus on other things. But the issue for New Zealand, I see with all of this, is that AUKUS involves nuclear proliferation. It involves the export of highly enriched uranium to Australia. Australia is not a nuclear power. United Kingdom and United States both are nuclear powers. They both have nuclear weapons. But Australia does not. But Australia would be getting highly enriched uranium in these submarines that would not be subject to IAEA monitoring. And that's because there's a loophole in the non-proliferation treaty. And it sets a bad precedent for New Zealand to be giving a green light to this. I think it sets a bad precedent for Australia. I think it's not a good move to be accepting of this proliferation, because in theory, highly enriched uranium, even if it's in a nuclear reactor in a submarine, in theory, it could be used for nefarious purposes. It could be repurposed into a nuclear weapons program. I think that's really unlikely that it would happen with Australia, but it's a bad precedent to set for other countries who might be considering this loophole. If they want highly enriched uranium, they get a friendly country to send it to them in a submarine, and then they can take it out and use it for whatever they want. It's a pretty bad precedent.
Mr. Miller, I know you're very busy, and I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about the presence of China. Now, again, based on another recent article, that when we talk about this cybersecurity and also this digital influence from China, and then this year that the relationship between China with some of the island and seem to grow much closer, and which is very concerning for some of the countries, for example, the US and Australia. And even one article came out and to say, for China, under this Belt and Road Initiative, that China is moving quickly or in this unstoppable speed regarding this what we call digital Silk Road, and which is very, very concerning, especially for Australia, for New Zealand, and the US, again, just cross the Indo-Pacific. Now, Dr. Miller, I want to get your reaction in this. So in other words, how do you think, or how should we evaluate this relationship between China with some of the islands, like, for example, Kiribati and Solomon Island, and etc.? And also, what about this digital Silk Road from the Chinese government? What is the end goal for the project, in your opinion?
Well, things are really heating up, aren't they, Will, around the Pacific, and that's why there's so much focus on New Zealand. It's clear that China does want to develop its relations with Pacific countries. I don't think that's a great surprise. It's also not particularly new. I think China has been involved in the Pacific for decades. They are becoming more interested now, there's no doubt about that. And this year in particular, we've seen this military deal with Solomon Islands, and then 1 year the Chinese foreign minister attempted to sign a bigger multilateral agreement with a number of Pacific countries. So everything is heating up. I would see digital as part of that. I mean, the digital economy now is big business, so it's not all about bricks and mortar. Digital is going to be part of the China strategy, just as in the same way it's part of the Western strategy, what we talked about. So, I think we've got to be very careful here, because I feel like these tensions just grow, by the month this year. I think it's been good to see a slight recalibration at least from the New Zealand side on all of this. We've got to be careful about talking ourselves into a war in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen everything heating up over Taiwan after Nancy Pelosi's visit. I just think we need to be very careful here about what we're letting ourselves in for. And New Zealand, I think, really can still play that voice for peace, for dialogue. That's the word that Jacinda Ardern has kept using, dialogue. What I would like to see from New Zealand is New Zealand to actually start leading that dialogue position. Jacinda Ardern, uses his word dialogue and diplomacy, but it's almost as if she says this as rhetoric rather than something that New Zealand is responsible for enacting. I would like New Zealand to take the lead a bit more on these things and to use its voice. And when you look at something like AUKUS, I think this is where New Zealand falls short, because we have a disarmament minister whose role is to speak up for the nuclear-free policy. And he was at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York this month, still going on, I believe, at the UN. And he talked about nuclear proliferation, he talked about Iran, and he talked about Russia, but he didn't mention AUKUS. And I think we do ourselves a disservice. I think New Zealand owes itself, and I think it does a service actually to the world, and also to its friends. I think it does need to speak out from time to time. And the highly enriched uranium issue is a real issue. It's not good. It's nuclear proliferation by other means, and I think we should be calling that out and asking for a rethink. There are other options. France powers its submarines with low enriched uranium, so it doesn't use the highly enriched uranium that you could use in nuclear weapons. Now, there are disadvantages to that. It's not as good. You don't get the range when you don't use highly enriched uranium. You have to refuel more often, but you wouldn't be setting that dangerous precedent in terms of proliferation of highly enriched uranium. But Australia could still have nuclear powered submarines under that model. So I think it's these kinds of things New Zealand could be speaking out a bit more about, rather than sort of saying, none of this has got anything to do with us, because that seems to be the Jacinda Ardern's more natural position at the moment, is to say, look, we need dialogue on, the war in Ukraine, we need dialogue on Taiwan and so forth, but it's not really our job to do it. And that really seems to be what I take away from Jacinda Ardern's messaging at the moment. But, there's a lot in flux this year. There's just so much happened in the last 6 months, really, since Russia invaded Ukraine. It kicked off, we've set in motion a whole series of events, it seems like. So, I don't know what could happen in the next 6 months, but I'm sure we'll be surprised by some of the things that happen in the second half of this year and into next year.
That's right. Mr. Miller, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to this technological battle between US and China at this moment. Again, based on the recent article that says that China's involvement in this digital platform actually is causing quite waves for the US and also across the continent. For mainly Chinese tech companies in the submarine, internet cables, and 4G and 5G mobile networks, actually is making influence not only in some of the countries in Europe, but also mainly some of the countries in Southeast Asia. So, Mr. Miller, I want to wrap up our conversation. Want to ask you the question is, should we see the Chinese tech companies' involvement as a positive sign, or actually what you said before, we should be very cautious? But if so, how concerned should we be in terms of this 4G or 5G or mobile development, the cybersecurity coming from the Chinese government side?
Yeah, well, China's becoming a more developed economy, isn't it? So it's going to become more involved in high technology, high technology industries. So, things like 4G, 5G, I think you're going to expect more of that from China just because it's becoming a more developed economy. And not all of that needs to be scary. And again, I just think we need to be careful about talking ourselves into a war. Just because China is involved in 4G and 5G industry, that doesn't mean that it's all being used just to spy on the West. And I think that sometimes the implications that are being made that, Huawei's technology is all about, spyware. I think that's a really ridiculous claim. But, a lot of Western countries are very suspicious about Huawei and, for example, and 5G networks that they're building because they see this as a potential backdoor for Chinese spying. I think you've got to look at everything on a case-by-case basis, really, and, just avoid making, knee-jerk decisions just based on the fact that it's Chinese technology, for example. Things are heating up. China clearly has, an interest in cyber attacks and cyber security. So does the West. So I think we're all playing increasingly in this, in these high tech industries, and they can be used for good and they can be used for bad. So we need to, keep an eye on all of this and look at everything on a case-by-case basis. But I think we have to be very, careful of hypocrisy. Just coming back to AUKUS, it's all very well to talk about the risks of, nuclear weapons and nuclear disaster from countries we disagree with, but if we ignore the problems caused by ourselves or by our friends, and AUKUS does provide real problems in that respect. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. I think we need to just look at everything on its merits and call out problems where we see them.
Indeed. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking to Mr. Jeffrey Miller, and Mr. Miller is an international analyst with the Democracy Project. Mr. Miller, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show again. Again, every time when we talk to you, I thoroughly enjoy the conversation. Not only that you always bring insightful information to us, but also help us to understand some of the critical issues across the continent, especially regarding New Zealand. Mr. Miller, thank you so much for doing this.